What if I told you that sometimes the deepest form of loneliness happens not when you're alone, but when you're right next to someone who no longer sees you? This is the story of Clare Bennett and Ethan Carter, a tale that speaks to the silent fractures that can form within relationships and how, against all odds, those fractures can become the starting point for something new. But beneath this personal story lies a universal truth. The way we navigate silence, betrayal, and forgiveness can either imprison us or set us free. Clare Bennett had not always been invisible. Once she had been a vibrant young woman with a love for art and life. She inherited her father's keen eye for beauty and his gentle heart. She spent her days sketching street corners, painting moments that others missed, and dreaming of a life filled with both love and purpose. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After her father's sudden passing, a web of obligations began to tighten around her. Claire's father had left not only his vast corporate empire, but also unspoken expectations regarding her future. Among those expectations was an unspoken agreement that Claire would marry Ethan Carter, her father's trusted protege, a brilliant but emotionally distant man who was now poised to lead Carter Industries into its next chapter. Ethan had built a reputation as a shrewd strategist, someone who could turn failing divisions into profit centers and charm board members into alliances. But behind the headlines, he remained a mystery. Reserved, calculating, and always in control, Ethan treated life like a chessboard. Marriage to him was simply another strategic move, a way to solidify his hold over the company and fulfill a promise made to a man he had once admired. The marriage was arranged swiftly with all the trappings of a high society event. Photographers captured the perfect moments, Claire's delicate smile, Ethan's confident stance. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Claire entered the marriage with cautious hope, telling herself that love could grow, that perhaps there was more to Ethan than met the eye. Ethan, for his part, viewed the arrangement as a contract necessary but inconvenient. Emotion had no place in this transaction. At first, Claire clung to hope. She imagined that love might grow, that beneath Ethan's polished armor was a man capable of seeing her, not just the heiress to her father's empire. She decorated their home with care, filled it with light and warmth. She prepared dinners, bought books they might read together, planned small surprises, a new blend of tea, a hand-drawn card slipped onto his desk. Each gesture was met with polite indifference or, worse, silence. Slowly her hope began to wither. 2 years passed in this manner. In that span, Claire became a ghost in her own life. Her days were a series of rituals performed in solitude. She awoke to an empty bed, made breakfast for one, wandered through empty halls. Ethan came and went with the cold precision of a man married to his work. They exchanged pleasantries when required. Good morning, good night. But there was no touch, no shared laughter, no moments of genuine intimacy. Claire's art supplies gathered dust. She stopped sketching, convinced that the colors of the world had faded. The bright woman who had once captured the poetry of everyday life became a muted version of herself. The silence of her home mirrored the silence of her heart. Now, this might sound like the tragic arc of countless unfulfilled relationships, but here's where Claire's story takes a turn. Because even in the depths of that silence, a part of her remained defiant, a part that refused to be entirely extinguished. It was their second wedding anniversary, a date that to the outside world should have been celebrated with fanfare. Claire expected nothing. Ethan had shown no sign of remembering the date. There had been no mention of plans, no glimmer of recognition. Still, something inside her stirred. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps a final act of self-respect. She decided to prepare a dinner not for Ethan but for herself, to remind herself that she was still here, still capable of creating beauty. She wore a dress she had purchased in a more hopeful time, a soft blue gown that complemented her delicate features. She set the table with care-lit candles, arranged flowers. The house for once felt alive. When Ethan arrived home late, the usual script seemed ready to play out a nod, a retreat to his study. But this time Claire intercepted him. With a calm steadiness she surprised even herself with she invited him to dinner. "Just dinner," she said quietly. To her astonishment, Ethan hesitated, then agreed. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation, but a conversation, tentative, fragile. They spoke of mundane things at first, the weather, an article Claire had read. But gradually the conversation deepened. There in the flickering candlelight with no distractions, Ethan finally allowed a crack to appear in his carefully constructed facade. He confessed that he had built walls out of fear, not just fear of intimacy, but fear of losing control. He admitted that he had entered the marriage believing he could compartmentalize it, treating it as another business obligation. Claire, her voice trembling, shared her loneliness, her yearning for connection, and the ache that had hollowed her from within. That night, for the first time in 2 years, they truly saw each other not as CEO and heiress, not as players in a corporate game, but as two flawed, wounded human beings. A fragile thread of connection was spun across the table. But life, as Claire would soon learn, has a way of testing even the most fragile beginnings. Have you ever had a moment where pretending led to something unexpectedly real? Please comment below and like this video. If you believe the best love stories start with honesty, subscribe our channel now for more powerful story-based videos every day. The next morning, with cautious hope blooming in her heart, Claire moved through her usual routine. She tidied Ethan's study, humming softly as though her heart wanted to believe that something had changed, and it had, but not in the way she expected. As she rearranged a stack of papers, her fingers brushed against a folder she had never seen before. Curiosity nudged her forward. Inside were emails and a contract that would shatter her fragile hopes. The contract detailed the original agreement between Ethan and her father, a deal that promised Ethan a significant portion of company shares in exchange for marrying Claire. The emails laid bare the cold negotiations, the timelines, the discussions of asset consolidation. Nowhere in those documents was there mention of Claire as a person, only as leverage. The room seemed to tilt. Claire's vision blurred. In an instant, every moment of doubt, every unanswered question, every instance of Ethan's distance became devastatingly clear. The marriage had not only been a strategic arrangement, it had been a deception. She had been traded like stock. In that moment, Claire's identity fractured. She was no longer the hopeful wife, no longer the dutiful daughter. She was a woman who had been used, her worth reduced to numbers on a ledger. The folder in her trembling hands became impossibly heavy. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the weight of this new reality crashed down upon her. The moments they had shared the previous night, the quiet conversation, Ethan's admission of fear, the fragile spark of hope now felt tainted, their sincerity called into question by the cold language of a legal contract. How much of that dinner had been genuine? Had Ethan known she might find the truth? Had his confession been a calculated move or an authentic glimpse of a man wrestling with guilt? The questions circled endlessly, offering no relief. In the hours that followed, Claire drifted through the house like a ghost, her mind trapped in a looping nightmare. The walls that had once seemed indifferent now felt oppressive. Every object, every photograph seemed to mock her. The home she had so carefully curated was no longer hers. It was a gilded cage built on lies. But even in her devastation, a new clarity emerged. Claire realized she could not stay not like this. To remain would be to betray herself further. She needed space, a place where she could think, breathe, and begin the painful process of reclaiming her sense of self. Without waiting for Ethan's return, Claire packed a small bag. Essentials only: clothes, sketchbooks, her father's old watch, and the courage that had somehow survived beneath years of quiet despair. She left a simple note on the kitchen counter: "I need time. Please respect that." Stepping out of the house, Claire felt both terror and a strange exhilaration. For the first time in years, she was making a choice for herself, not for her father, not for Ethan, not for anyone but Claire. She hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of a small apartment complex across town, a place she had once admired for its sunlit windows and modest charm. The apartment was stark, its walls bare, but to Claire it was a sanctuary. There were no expectations here, no haunting echoes of a marriage built on falsehoods. Just space, space to grieve, to think, to begin again. In the days that followed, Claire allowed herself to feel every emotion: anger, sorrow, bitterness, relief. She cried until her body ached, sketched furiously when words failed her, and walked the city streets in search of fragments of herself she feared she had lost. Gradually, the numbness began to lift. Colors returned, muted at first, then sharper. She rediscovered the joy of a well-drawn line, the comfort of tea sipped slowly in silence, the freedom of a day unshaped by anyone else's expectations. Ethan's response was restrained, a single text message: "I'll wait." No pleas, no demands, just those two words. Whether it was respect, guilt, or hope that kept him from pursuing her further, Claire couldn't say. For now it was enough. She needed distance. During her solitude, Claire reflected on the patterns that had defined her life. For so long, she had moved according to the wishes of others: her father's legacy, Ethan's ambitions, society's expectations. Even her art had become secondary sacrifice on the altar of a marriage that had left her invisible. But here in this small apartment, Claire began to ask herself new questions. What did she want? Who was she outside the roles others had assigned her? Could she ever trust again, not just another person, but herself? Such questions are not unique to Claire. They are questions many of us face when confronted with betrayal or disillusionment. Whether in relationships, careers, or friendships, discovering that we have been used or undervalued forces a painful reckoning. It strips away illusions and demands that we rebuild from a place of authenticity. For Claire, this rebuilding was slow and uneven. There were setbacks, nights when doubt crept in, when she wondered if leaving had been a mistake. But there were also victories, small, vital moments of self-assertion. She reconnected with old friends, attended an art workshop, even exhibited a few pieces at a local gallery. With each step, her confidence grew. Weeks passed, then months. The rhythm of Claire's new life stabilized. Yet beneath her growing strength, an unfinished chord remained, a need for closure, for truth. She realized she could not fully move forward without confronting Ethan one last time, not to seek reconciliation, but to reclaim her voice. She reached out to him, not with a letter or a phone call, but with an invitation, a simple message: meet me by the lake, tomorrow, noon. The lake had once been a place of solace for Claire and her father, a place where they had walked and talked for hours. It felt fitting that this conversation should happen there, far from the polished boardrooms and curated facades of their old life. The next day dawned clear and cool. Claire, dressed simply, comfortable, unadorned herself. As she approached the lake, she saw Ethan already waiting, hands in his pockets, his usually composed expression tinged with uncertainty. For a moment they stood in silence. Then Claire spoke calmly, firmly. She told him everything: the devastation of discovering the contract, the sense of betrayal that had shattered her, the journey she had undertaken to reclaim her autonomy. Her words were measured but unflinching. This was not a performance, not a bid for sympathy. It was truth offered without apology. Ethan listened, his gaze steady but shadowed. When she finished, he spoke not with excuses, but with an admission. He acknowledged the deal, the cowardice that had kept him silent, the fear that had driven him to distance himself rather than confront the reality of their situation. He admitted that in trying to honor a promise to her father, he had failed the person who mattered most, Claire. There was no dramatic embrace, no promises of immediate reconciliation. Claire made it clear forgiveness was not a given, nor was a future together. If there was to be any path forward, it would have to be built on honesty and choice, not obligation. For Ethan, this was a reckoning. For Claire, it was a release. In the weeks that followed, their lives remained separate, but with a new undercurrent of possibility. They began to communicate not as husband and wife, but as two individuals seeking understanding. Ethan attended therapy, confronted parts of himself he had long ignored. Claire continued to build her new life, anchored in self-respect and authenticity. Then came the day of the board meeting, a pivotal moment, not just for Ethan, but for Claire. News of their estrangement had begun to circulate, fueling speculation about Ethan's fitness to lead. Claire chose that moment to act, not to defend Ethan, but to assert her own agency. She entered the boardroom with quiet grace, addressed the assembled executives with calm authority. "My marriage," she said, "is not a matter for corporate scrutiny. My choices are my own. I will not be used to bolster or diminish anyone's standing." Her words resonated not just with the board, but with Ethan. In that moment, he saw the strength Claire had found, the woman she had always been beneath the weight of expectation. From that point, a new chapter began. Claire and Ethan did not rush back into their marriage. They met for tea, for walks, for conversations that held space for both pain and possibility. They rebuilt not what had been, but what might yet be, something chosen, not imposed. And perhaps that is the truest form of love, not one born from obligation or fairy tale narratives, but one forged in the crucible of truth, autonomy, and mutual respect. The rhythm between Claire and Ethan shifted like a gentle tide, no longer the stormy silence of before, nor the fragile hope of that dinner years ago, but something quieter, slower, more deliberate. They didn't label what they were rebuilding. Claire wouldn't allow it, and Ethan this time didn't try to define it either. They existed in the space between apology and permission, between what had been broken and what could still be grown. Claire returned to her art, but it wasn't the same work she'd done before. Her new pieces carried weight layers of shadow and light, vulnerability and resistance. In one gallery, showing a visitor stood silently before a large canvas depicting a woman half submerged in water, her reflection fragmented across ripples. "It's like she's choosing to surface," the visitor whispered. Claire said nothing, but inside she felt understood. And in many ways, that's what healing looks like. Not perfection, not linear growth, but a slow surfacing. A recognition that even when love starts from the wrong place, when it's wrapped in deals, expectation, or fear, it can still evolve. But only if both people are willing to unravel the illusions and start again with honesty. Ethan, for his part, was not the same man. He had built empires with his mind, but had never learned to lead with his heart. Now he sat through therapy sessions not because it would win Claire back, but because he finally wanted to understand why he had kept people, especially her, at a distance. He began visiting the community arts center where Claire taught workshops, not to interfere, but to witness. Sometimes he sat at the back unnoticed. Other times he brought coffee. He never asked her to come home. He simply stayed present. That was new. For the first time in their relationship, Ethan let go of control. He allowed Claire to lead, not in deference but in trust. Real love, after all, isn't about possession. It's about presence, and presence requires patience. There's a truth here that extends beyond Claire and Ethan's story. We live in a world that celebrates speed, quick fixes, fast recoveries, overnight turnarounds. But emotional repair doesn't follow that rhythm. It requires stillness, time, willingness, and perhaps most importantly, humility. Think of the friend you lost touch with because of an unspoken grudge, the colleague you stopped talking to after one misunderstanding, the partner you hurt or were hurt by and never fully faced again. These aren't just lost connections. They're unfinished conversations. They're chapters we closed before knowing how they might have ended if both sides had dared to open the book again. Claire and Ethan dared, but their story isn't one of fairy tale resolution. And that's why it matters. There was no dramatic wedding renewal, no public declarations. There was instead a long walk through the woods on a crisp autumn day, a moment where Ethan reached for her hand, not with expectation, but with hope. Claire didn't pull away. She also didn't say anything. She just let their fingers rest together as they walked in silence. Sometimes the silence that once destroyed you can become the space where healing begins, if it's filled with intention instead of fear. Months later, Claire invited Ethan to one of her exhibitions, not as her husband, not even as a partner, but as a guest. The gallery was packed. On one wall hung a new series titled The Witness. Each piece depicted a pair of figures, one in motion, one still. Some reached for each other, others stood apart, but in each painting there was an unmistakable thread of connection, however distant. Ethan stood before a piece where a woman stood on a rooftop, wind whipping her hair, while a man sat below on the street, looking up, eyes filled with something unspoken. He turned to Claire, who had walked up beside him, and said quietly, "I don't know if I'm the man on the street or the rooftop." She replied, "Maybe we take turns." That night they left the gallery together, not to return to the past, but to keep walking into whatever came next. Here's the truth this story reveals: love doesn't always arrive in the way we expect. Sometimes it begins as a contract, a duty, a mistake. And sometimes the most honest love emerges not in the beginning, but in the aftermath. But only if we're willing to break the silence. And silence, true silence, isn't just the absence of sound. It's the absence of recognition. It's what happens when someone you care about stops trying to see you, or you stop trying to be seen. In Claire's case, silence meant erasure. In Ethan's, it meant avoidance. But once they named that silence, once they gave it form and confronted it, they could finally start rebuilding. I think we've all been there in some form. Silenced in a relationship, overlooked at work, unseen in a friendship. The hardest part isn't always the betrayal or the failure. It's the quiet afterward, the echoing question, was I ever real to them? Claire's courage was not in leaving, though. That took strength. Her real courage was in choosing not to harden, in returning to the conversation and giving truth a voice, in showing Ethan and herself that the story wasn't finished. And Ethan's redemption wasn't in some grand romantic gesture. It was in his humility, in his willingness to sit in discomfort, to relinquish power, to wait without demanding. Too many stories in media end at the reunion. The couple reconciles, cue music, fade to black. But real healing doesn't end there. Real healing begins at the uncomfortable truth that love alone is not enough. It must be paired with effort, with growth, with mutual willingness to face who you were and who you now choose to become. In Claire and Ethan's case, love became a verb, a practice, an invitation renewed each day. So here's the takeaway for you, for me, for anyone listening. If you're in a relationship marked by silence, you don't have to accept it as your fate. Speak, try, risk being misunderstood, risk being rejected, because the alternative, living unseen, is far worse. If you've hurt someone and don't know how to come back, don't start with grand gestures. Start with honesty, with presence, with patience. And if you've been betrayed, know this: your worth was never in the role they assigned you. It was in how you chose to respond, with grace, with strength, with truth. Claire didn't get a perfect marriage. What she got was better. She got her voice back, her art back, herself back. And in the end, maybe she got a partner who finally chose her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. That's not a fairy tale. That's real, and it's more than enough. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If Claire's story touched you, imagine how many others are trapped in silence today. If you believe that no one deserves to be part of a fake marriage, hit that like button to spread this message. And if you want to hear more real stories of courage, betrayal, and healing, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story might just change how you see love forever.